Hey guys, how you all doing? It's Sam from Gemini, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about how I went from Taekwondo to karate. Booyah! Okay guys, so thank you for coming back to the channel and for tuning into another video, and we have got another story. So this one is about how I went from practicing Taekwondo predominantly to predominantly practicing Kyokushin karate. So for those who know me personally, and a few of my subscribers have met me, and we've spoken at length about my martial arts career and my upbringing of martial arts to date. So for those who know me, and as the channel name Gemini-TKD Sam would give off the impression, I started my martial arts career in Taekwondo. Now I started in ITF for about a year, from 1997 to 1998, and I then transitioned to WT, or WTF Taekwondo as it was called then, at a club in Stenning called Stenning Taekwondo Club. So I was with Stenning Taekwondo Club from 1999 to 2006. When the club officially disbanded and the instructor went his own way. And I went off to India, and I was on a teaching contract in India. But during that time, between 1999 and 2006, when I was a member of Stenning Taekwondo Club, I did no martial arts style except WT Taekwondo. That was all I knew at this stage. So basically what was taught to me at the time was, from the instructors, it was like, this is Taekwondo, this is what you're going to learn. And the instructors at the time, they had like smidgings of knowledge of various different martial arts like Jiu-Jitsu, Aikido, very minimal Kung Fu, very minimal, I think it was like Shotokan or Wado-ryu style of karate. But they didn't really get incorporated too much into the main syllabus of this Taekwondo school. It was pretty much like Taekwondo driven, like 95 to 98% was WT Taekwondo. So that's all I knew. That's all I knew. Only towards the end of my tenure with Stenning Taekwondo Club, I personally even went out and started learning bits and bobs of different other martial arts, just smidgings here, smidgings there. Much to the chagrin, I feel, of my Taekwondo school and certain people in the Taekwondo school. But for the most part, like I said, it was just Taekwondo, and that's all I knew at this stage, for the most part. When Stenning Taekwondo Club closed and everybody went their separate ways, I went off to India, did my teaching contract in India, teaching martial arts out in India, and teaching German, teaching foreign languages, and various different cultural relativistic subjects and humanities out in India. Came back to England in December 2006, opened up my own school called Shiva Soviet, which is another story in itself. There's a story behind that name. But I opened up my first professional school called Shiva Soviet, and that was pretty much a Taekwondo school, but it was more like a full contact, body armorless type of Taekwondo. It was almost like a traditional Taekwondo. And I remember with Shiva Soviet, I wanted to basically have Taekwondo as the driving vehicle behind the syllabus of the school, but I wanted to have like including other bits of styles which I'd learnt as well into the mix, which I don't feel I was allowed to necessarily explore or train per se or play with when I was at Stenning Taekwondo Club. So Shiva Soviet gave me the opportunity to really bring those other experiences in and form something quite new. But despite that, still majority of my syllabus was Taekwondo based, and that stayed that way right up until 2008, when I started competing in open competitions. And this was my first exposure to this. I mean, prior to this, I had a history of competing in Taekwondo competitions. 2008 changed because my school, Shiva Soviet, we started doing a lot more open martial arts competitions. We got exposed to a lot more different styles, predominantly karate styles. And it really opened up my mind. It's kind of like there are other styles and ways of doing things. There's not just one way to skin a cat, which has become one of my mottos in life. you know, there's a number of different ways to do something, and I found that by keeping that open mind, I was actually then a lot more open and receptive and cordial to other martial arts styles and their approaches. So that started 2008. That kind of like planted the seed of me thinking there are other schools of thought out there which I can explore a bit more fully. But it wasn't really until 2011, which is when I got my first full proper exposure to Kyokushin. Now, anybody who knows Kyokushin knows it's probably not the, how do I put this? It's not the easiest avenue into karate for people who don't really have that much exposure to karate. Of course, a lot of people, you know, they start off in Kyokushin quite young, and that's all they train in. That's fine. But how I got into Kyokushin, I just did a competition in December 2010, and it was a forms competition, and I was competing up against a guy who did karate. He beat me on forms by 0.01 of a point. But afterwards, you know, we joked about it. We had a bit of banter, and you know, he was, oh, you know, what style do you do? And I was like, you know, predominantly Taekwondo. What style do you do? And he was like, oh, Kyokushin. And I was just like, Kyokushin. And by this time, I'd never heard of Kyokushin, so it was just like, if I nod politely, I'll just pretend that I know what you're talking about. But inside, I was like, I have no idea what the hell this is. And you know, we got talking more. We added each other on Facebook at the time, and eventually, it came 2011, and he was putting together this summer camp for predominantly Kyokushin, but it was also other Japanese styles as well, a lot of groundwork styles, which I never had exposure to up until this time. And he invited me. He was like, you know, I remember meeting you at this competition, you know, would you be interested in coming along and rolling with us? You know, it's a 3-day weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It's traditional based. I mean, this guy was very, very traditional. He was very hot on his traditionalism. So I was like, you know, as long as you don't come in like Mukdojo uniforms and stuff, he was like, yeah, just come in like a traditional gi or dobok. I didn't have a gi at the time. And he was like, as long as you're just like respectful of the Japanese traditions. I understand that me as a person, I didn't know that much about Japanese culture or tradition, but it was like, you know, as long as you're respectful to the Japanese traditions, and some of the things may seem a bit weird, but as long as you just kind of keep an open mind, you'll be fine. So I was like, yeah, you know, it's great. An opportunity to train in a new style or styles which I didn't know about. And I was like, I'm up for this. So got there on this Friday. We pitched our tents up, like this campsite just outside of Crawley in West Sussex. Had this big massive brief at the beginning. Then the instructor was like, okay, you know, let's all meet on the field and just have a light sparring session. And light Kyokushin, I don't believe the words light and Kyokushin go in the same sentence. This this was a hammering session. You know, it was quite a few hours, like 2 hours, I think, of just pure kumite, Japanese for sparring, and I was against this guy who was basically built like a brick. He didn't have the flexibility or the speed that I did from my Taekwondo upbringing. But when I got hit by him, I felt every single punch, and he was being very scientific with how he was punching me, how he was kicking me. He was kicking me in places I didn't even know really kind of existed, and I was like, "What the hell's all this?" And he was just like, "You know, it's just how we fight." And I was like, "Wow, this is different." You know, I was getting kicked in the thigh. You know, I was getting, you know, seikan. They told me that when they punch their fortune knuckles, it's called seikan. But they weren't like punching flat-fisted. They were actually angling the fist downwards, so the seikan would actually go into areas like the area where you have your injections and into the ribs, and they're even punching onto my thighs and stuff. And I was like, I've never come across this before. I was like, it was both scary, but it was both fun at the same time. I was like, wow, I can learn. And as the weekend wore on, the majority of what we did was sparring. And what I'd like to stress here about this weekend, it was the pivotal moment, I think, of my martial arts career and training. In the space of 3 days, it changed my whole perception of martial arts. It changed my whole attitude towards how I trained. It changed my direction of changing. And I realized, actually, throughout these whole 3 days of predominantly just doing kumite, in the hottest days of the year, I remember, wearing like black gis and doboks as the sun was coming over like the hill and went over this field, and you could just feel the heat. And for doing this for like 4 or 5 hours non-stop a day, it was a real torturous session. like for those 3 days, and I remember coming away at the end of those 3 days, bruises all over my body in various different places. And people on Facebook were leaving like little status updates saying like, yeah, my neck, my arms, my biceps, my triceps, my inner thigh, my outer thigh, my groin, all the areas where I've got bruises. And then somebody else would comment and be like, yeah, well, I've got bruises here, there, and everywhere. And it almost became a bit like a bantery kind of camaraderie of saying like, who had the most bruises by the end of this 3-day weekend. But yeah, I mean, I was then introduced to Kyokushin sparring. And I remember actually one guy I went up against, he came up to me during a break and he was like, you do Taekwondo, don't you? And I was like, yeah, I do. And he kind of goes, oh, okay. So you're pretty good with your legs, aren't you? And at the time, me being young, I was like, yeah, you know, I can handle my legs. And he just goes, all right. And he just turns around and walks off. And I look at him and think, a bit weird, but okay, whatever. Later on that day, we paired up against each other to kumite. And as soon as the sensei went, right, hajime, and we began, first thing this guy did, he did like an outside, outer thigh kick to my thigh, with making contact with his shin, and the agony just went right through my legs, and I was like, what the F is this? Then bam, he did it to my other side. Then he was doing these kicks to the insides of my thigh as well. And as the spar went on, I realised I couldn't even lift up my legs to kick because they were just throbbing and swollen, both inside and out. And I was like, I've never come across this kind of sparring before, so I don't know how to respond to this. And as well, this guy had been targeting my legs. He was very scientific. He targeted my areas, which he saw were my strong points. So he was like taking out my heavy artillery, knowing that I could punch back because, you know, I've always favoured punching. Well, I've always valued punches as well. So I've always trained in punching too. But I knew that my punches were not up to the standard of his Kyokushin ones. And when I did manage to get some flurries of punches in, I was more akin to boxing punches. He came really close and was then using real sharp, jabby kind of punches. Again, targeting like my solar plexus, targeting the arms, targeting the ribs. And by the end of it, I was just a crippled wreck. When the sensei was like, okay, you know, finish. And this guy came back into his ready position. He was like, yeah, not too good with your legs, really, are you? I was like, well, I was good, but you just messed it up. But he meant it all in good spirits. But yeah, going back to that point I said about this was like a turning point for me, because I remember coming away from that 3-day weekend and realising that I had so many holes in my approach from simply adopting this WT Taekwondo perspective, which I had up until that time. And I remember thinking, I've never come across Kyokushin before, but I came away after those 3 days with a huge amount of respect for Kyokushin. And I remember saying to the other member of Gemini at the time, I was like, that is what I want to train in. It's like, I want for Gemini to get stronger and better and more well-rounded in general. I want to steer it away from Taekwondo and actually have Kyokushin as a driving force. And that's what happened for the next, I'd say about 3 or 4 years. When I came to sparring training, all I trained was Kyokushin. And whether rightly or wrongly, I kind of excluded everything else. But yeah, my favourite technique was the outer thigh kick. I would practice that for hours, perfecting that. And I found that I was just becoming more and more drawn into the world of karate, and specifically Kyokushin, and in general, Japanese culture, than I was Korean. But I think when I actually then did a lot of like self-reflecting, and I thought back to my Taekwondo stuff, I realised actually a lot of the Taekwondo I learned was crap. And I learned that actually a lot of the Taekwondo I remember actually explaining in my therapy session once, I said I felt as though I'd been shortchanged. I'd been taught like a joke, so to speak, or taught techniques which were unpragmatic and nonsensical. And I remember looking at Kyokushin and thinking like all that I learned, and I did like the Kyokushin instructor that I had, I then went up to and, you know, started learning properly from him. But in terms of material, what did I learn from Kyokushin was actually not that much, but the stuff which I did learn, the little I did learn, was effective. There was no wasted motion. It was very economical. It was very to the point. It was very much, this is what we're going to practice today. This does that. That does this. Use this when you're in this situation. When you're in this situation, use that. It was just so logical and so straightforward, so matter of fact. It was so refreshing. And I was like, my God. And it made me realize how much I actually didn't know. So I became much more efficient and much more confident in myself. Because I think actually at first, after that long weekend, I remember thinking like, my God, I was going around with a false sense of security or false sense of confidence. But after this, I was like, I really did have a whole new appreciation. I looked at techniques differently. I looked at kicks differently. I looked at punches differently. And I found myself mature a lot as a person, both as a martial artist and as a general person, and much more appreciative of these techniques and what they can actually do to someone. Um, but also just in general with Japanese culture, I found myself wanting to study a lot more about Japan. And I was thinking, okay, so what is this country which has given birth to Kyokushin? Even though, ironically, Kyokushin was actually invented by a Korean who'd actually gone to Japan, and he adapted a Japanese name, who's more commonly known as Mazoyama. So that's a little bit of an irony. But in general, I wanted to learn more and more about Japanese culture in general, anything about Japan, the Japanese language. When I got my cats, I wanted to actually give one a Japanese name. But then my wife didn't want to give it a Japanese name, so we made, yeah, I said, okay, you know, that's fine, we don't have to give it a Japanese name. But I became very much enthralled with Japan as a country. Nowadays, if I was to go on holiday to the Far East, I would choose Japan over Korea. Nothing against Korean people, but it's just I find Japan much more of a fascinating place. I think for me personally, I'm amazed by how contradictory Japan can be as a country. It's super polite, it's super traditional, but at the same time, it's super modern and actually quite savage as a culture. Buddhism and Shintoism are the main religions you're going to find in Japan. Of course, you get other religions as well, but for the most part, you're going to get Shintoism or Buddhism. Now, both Buddhism and Shintoism are generally regarded as quite peaceful. We could get into debate about religion, but that's not for this video. But despite saying how peaceful Buddhism and Shintoism is, look at Japanese history and you actually realize actually Japan's had a very brutal, savage history. So I was very fascinated by how these contradictions can kind of come together. Sorry, getting a bit excited. Not in that way. But I then liken Japan to a yin-yang. It's a series of opposites, always swirling in motion, but it seems to work quite fluidly. And even now, training as a therapist, most of my training has been in mindfulness and person-centered therapy. And part of my studies, incidentally, I actually have a book here. It's called Kaizen, which Kaizen, this whole book is actually just about mindful therapy techniques. But Kaizen is actually a Japanese word, which means constant, never-ending improvement. And part of the Kaizen philosophy is that you don't just do one thing and you're improved, or that's your end game. Kaizen is a series of like very small incremental steps which gradually make you better and better as time goes on. But the process of Kaizen is that you're never going to be complete. You're always going to be improving yourself in some way, shape or form. Because if you were to say complete your perfection, where'd you go then? Nothing. Nobody's perfect. Nothing is perfect. And I think it's quite naive to believe that if you keep improving yourself, you will become perfect. You won't. But what you will become with each step you make to help on your improvement, you become more aware of where your gaps are. You become more aware of where your errors and your fallacies are, and you can work on those. Then, once you've worked on those, you may realize that there's actually a gap somewhere else. So then you go over there to work on that. But that's getting a bit more into like a therapeutic mindset. But that whole philosophy, Kaizen philosophy, from Japan, and it's one of my driving forces now when I use my therapeutic techniques. So yeah, I mean, that was 2011, July 2011, when I first had my exposure to Kyokushin. That was what changed my whole martial direction into a new direction. I genuinely feel it was a change for the better, for myself, for my martial arts direction and career, for my understanding, and for me as a person in general. it's really opened up so many doors. And I quite often look back now, and you know, it's always easy in hindsight, because hindsight, people think, oh, we've got the luxury of hindsight. We can look back and think, why did I do that? Why didn't I do this? But I look back now and think, if I could go back, say to like when I first started learning martial arts, and I was saying, right, you have a choice. You can either go to this Taekwondo school, or you could go to this Kyokushin school, which I learned from. And I'd say to myself, which would you rather do? And if I had the knowledge and the wisdom which I do now, and I could go back then, I'd actually say to my younger self, go for the Kyokushin. You'll get more out of Kyokushin. It'll give you more. Again, this is just my personal experience. You know, everybody's different. But I'd say to myself, for what I want out of martial arts, from what I wanted out of martial arts, go and take the Kyokushin. It'll make you much more appreciative of martial arts and what it can give me personally. I found myself, when I started doing Kyokushin and when I started really delving into Kyokushin and getting more involved in it, I found myself developing much more a sense of peace in myself. I found myself become a lot more relaxed, a lot more confident. I wasn't as irate as a lot of time which I had been. And, you know, I'm a human being at the end of the day. I do have my faults and my fallacies, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't. But I found that the Taekwondo which I did developed quite a bit of arrogance in me. That's debatable whether that's causal. You know, doing Taekwondo makes you arrogant, but I don't think that's just for myself. I mean, a lot of people who I know who've done Taekwondo have proven themselves to be incredibly arrogant people. I don't know if that's, again, like I say, I don't know if that's causal. I don't know if the Taekwondo breeds the arrogance, or if they just happen to be generally arrogant people, or other systemic influences are there as well. But I found that when I started doing Kyokushin, and especially when I got more involved in Kyokushin, a lot of that arrogance went away. It crumbled, or I managed to challenge a lot of that arrogance. And I then sat down and said to myself, look, this is a huge wake-up call for you. You're not king of the hill. There are people here who could seriously hurt you. And it's like, you need to start respecting these people, because if you don't, you're going to get seriously hurt. And it wasn't just me saying that, trying to put on this kind of like blasé, fake, pseudo, humble kind of character. But I genuinely said to myself, okay, I'm going to take myself back to a white belt level. And I'm going to learn each step of the way, each grade going up. I'm not going to look at myself with a black belt mentality anymore. I'm going to look at myself as a very grassroots beginner. And I'm glad I did that, because I think that was the best approach to do when I got involved in Kyokushin. So that was just a very brief, I appreciate it's quite a long video, but that was just like a story I wanted to tell about how I transitioned from Taekwondo to Kyokushin. Okay, so to answer a question, I suppose, of self-identity, do I identify as a karateka, or do I identify myself as a taekwondoin? And I think the answer, quite honestly, is I don't identify as a martial artist anymore. My days of martial arts I've consciously retired from, but if I was to answer that question, I would say that I identify as an ex-karateka more than an ex-taekwondoin. And I think that's I like to think that's quite telling of actually which art I have a bit more heart towards, which was Kyokushin. Safe to say, I much enjoyed and much preferred my Kyokushin training than I did my Taekwondo training, for sure. But that's my personal story. Everybody else has their own stories about martial arts, why they've transitioned from one style to the next, or may even go back to another style, or create a new style. But anyway, guys, if you've got any thoughts about Kyokushin, if you've got experience with Kyokushin and Taekwondo, if you are thinking about taking up Kyokushin, or you think about taking up Taekwondo, as always, there's that comment section down there. It's there for a reason, and it's not for decoration. In the meantime, guys, love to hear from you. Stay safe, train hard, and keep reading about Kaizen philosophy, because it's one of the best mindfulness philosophies and therapeutic approaches I think I have ever come across. Create a pleasant workspace. Ooh. Except that you will have off days. How true that is. See you later, guys. Booyah!